Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Hi, welcome back. Today it is my pleasure to be interviewing Michelle Minton, a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. She specializes in consumer product safety, vaping and cannabis regulation, and also nutrition regulation. Today we're going to be talking about vaping, cannabis, and salt. Not salt like bath salts, though. It's sodium chloride salt. That, for a little bit, I was confused, but then I was like, wait, this makes sense. Okay, anyways. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So before we jump into this, I want to ask you, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Right, so I assume you're talking about college age, and I would
Yeah.
say this applies to your generation and all generations, really, including my own, a little bit older than you, just a little. I think what I would communicate, the importance of understanding integrity and why it is important to have personal integrity. And not just in terms of, well, if I have a bad reputation, I'm not going to get a job or people aren't going to like me, but for interacting with people, for having a satisfying work life, social life, for personal pride. I find integrity to be something missing in the conversation as an important value for people to have, of adhering to certain principles and values. Mine in particular are objectivity, where I try and communicate with people and engage in my research in an objective way, even while recognizing I have biases like everybody does, but trying my best to adhere to the specific principles that I find valuable. Always, every time. I don't succeed every time, but I think it's important, and I think more people should take personal integrity seriously.
That's a good point. Thank you. I mean, I always forget about it because I don't know. So in middle school, it was a big thing. That was one of our school's values that they tried to uphold.
Mhm.
But
Yes.
since then, I've not heard the word integrity that often. So nice reminder. Thank you. Okay. So you've been a fervent advocate of vaping, which to many white suburban mothers, it's like, oh, no. So can you explain to us exactly what vaping is and what the benefits of this technology are over smoking tobacco products?
Yeah, personally, I like to not describe myself as an advocate of vaping. I'm an advocate for people to be able to make their own best choices for their own lives, whatever that means to them. And vaping is just such a clear example of a product that has benefits for individuals, smokers, people who are, habituated to nicotine, who want to find a way. Everybody knows how dangerous it is to be, a lifelong smoker, how deadly it can be, all the diseases, all the problems that it can cause. Everyone knows this. People continue to smoke anyway. And I would say almost every single one of them would love to be able to get the benefits that they feel they derive from smoking in a way that was not going to kill them, frankly. And vaping, electronic cigarettes, nicotine vapor products, as well as other products now that are non-combustible, so things that you don't light on fire. These have all been pretty conclusively, it's hard to argue at this point that they aren't substantially safer than lighting something up and inhaling the products of combustion into your lungs every day for decades of your life. Really, the dangers associated with smoking primarily come from the fact that you are inhaling the products of burning paper, burning leaf, whatever it is. Nicotine itself, really not that dangerous, which is why the government has authorized in many iterations nicotine patches, gums, lozenges, etc. They even prescribe them for kids, for minors, who are trying to quit smoking. Nicotine itself, not really all that harmful. It does have some effects, and those effects can become, they have risks associated with them, but it's nowhere near. You're not going to get lung cancer from nicotine. which, and lung cancer and heart disease are the big primary drivers of smoking related deaths and disease.
Yeah, I mean, e-cigarettes, vaping, it's been around long enough now for respected health authorities to conclude, especially after so many studies, that it is safer than smoking cigarettes because of its delivery of
Mhm.
nicotine. I mean, it eliminates something like 95% of the harm that smoking cigarettes gives. Britain's Royal College of Physicians called any attempt by public health officials to discourage smokers from switching to vaping, quote, unjust, irrational, and immoral, end quote. Can you tell us more about like the harm reduction that scientists have observed with vaping?
Yeah, not just with vaping. So, I mean, if you look at Sweden, where there's a product called snus in Sweden, and it's basically a tobacco chew, a moist tobacco chew. It's different from the types of tobacco chew that we traditionally use in the U.S. But in Sweden, they've been using it for decades, pretty much since in the 60s and 70s when it started to become very clear how dangerous smoking was. A huge portion of Sweden's smoking population switched over to snus. It's now, I think, about 15% of their population use the product, and they have almost zero smoking in Sweden. And they have Europe's lowest rates of lung cancer and lung cancer death, not surprisingly. They also have, among the lowest in Europe, mouth cancer, which might surprise some people. We've seen harm reduction work in Japan, where heated tobacco products, like I think the only really commercially available one that I'm aware of is called IQOS from Philip Morris International. That was introduced in Japan, I think, about 3 or 4 years ago, and since then, they don't really seem to monitor smoking rates too closely, but cigarette sales have declined by 30%, which is absolutely astounding in Japan when the government owns, they have Japan Tobacco. So you just have in certain countries, it is not just those two. It's in a lot of places in the world, including the U.S. And England, where the smoking rates are they are dropping so much faster than they are in other countries, and it's primarily because you don't stop people from pursuing substances that they want to use simply by banning it, taxing it, trying to discourage it, stigmatizing its use. People will still either keep using that or something similar or something worse. However, you can encourage people to reduce the harm associated with behaviors, and harm reduction, not just with tobacco. Harm reduction is a accepted principle in global public health, right? We have clean needles for intravenous drug users because people wisely realized that simply banning intravenous drugs didn't stop people from using it, but it did push them into riskier behaviors, sharing needles and spreading disease. But if you have supervised sites, you can mitigate the risks of overdose. If you give them clean needles, you can mitigate the spread of diseases. And that's all worked really, really well. In some places in Canada, when they open up supervised injection sites, you see the overdose rate pretty much disappear because for the most part, people don't want to die. And they do want to use certain substances. They just want to do it in the safest way possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I don't know. A lot of people, especially talking to like health teachers at school and stuff, when we have to learn about this stuff, first, they don't mention any of the benefits that certain drugs can have and like the health benefits and like medical uses, but they really just talk about like drug users as though they don't necessarily care for their lives and as though they're willing to die for it. But really, like, I don't know. I feel like that's an unfair connection to make because I mean, some people might like not care at all if they live or die. But the thing is, that's true with any group of people. But when you think about like drug users wanting to use clean drugs and clean needles and all of that, why not? If it's available and you know it's safer, you probably don't want to die.
Yeah, no, the way we talk about drug users is so offensive and really harmful to people who use substances. There's a lot of most adults in America are substance users. We use caffeine every single day. We drink a cup of coffee. Some people drink a pot of coffee, and that is a drug that has effects on the body, physical effects. It's also a drug that you can become habituated to. I'm not going to say the word addiction. I don't like that word. I think that's overused and improperly used, but people have a caffeine habit, and they go into withdrawal when they don't have caffeine. But it's perfectly acceptable. A child can walk into Starbucks and get a coffee without too much, too many raised eyebrows. But when it comes to other substances, certain substances are deemed unacceptable. And then when you have the stigma, and you criminalize it, that's really where a lot of the problems come in. When people were using opium, when opium was in total widespread use among white people in America in the 19th century, there were some overdose deaths, but not all that much. There were plenty of opium addicts, if we want to say that, but it wasn't really seen as a problem until Chinese immigration started to increase, and opium smoking, even though that's fundamentally the same as using opium through medicinal tinctures, then it was seen as a social menace, a moral problem. And I think we're seeing that a lot with drugs and other aspects of public health, is that you can always point to the harms of any behavior. Literally any type of behavior can be associated with some kind of risk. We'll say not necessarily harm, but risk. But what rises to the level of national priority, legislative priority, really does seem to be dictated by a certain group of people in this country and their cultural norms and their values and the society they want to live in. And right now with nicotine, as I said, nicotine has loads of benefits scientifically proven. Whether or not that balances against the risks associated with nicotine in whatever form you want to use it, that's a question I think should be up to individuals and their doctors. But there's no doubt about it that there are benefits to nicotine, even if the benefit is simply some people enjoy it. They enjoy the feeling of using nicotine. But it is a moral issue, right? So if you present some people in public health and a lot of these, as you mentioned, white suburban moms, with the challenge of, if somebody could use nicotine with functionally zero harm, they're not going to get cancer of the lung, they're not going to have heart disease because of this, maybe because of their other habits, but not because of nicotine, would you still find it acceptable? And the answer that they have clearly given us at this point is no. And why is that? Because you're still addicted to something, and addiction is bad when it is this thing, because nicotine is intimately associated with smoking because of public health campaigns in the 80s and 90s. And smoking is not seen as a white, middle, and upper class thing to do. And unfortunately, white, middle class, suburban people are the most politically empowered in this country. So they pretty much dictate drug policy in this country.
And I think about alcoholics a lot. People who drink alcohol to the extent that it can be an addiction, that's all like cute. And I mean, not necessarily cute, but it's more accepted. And I mean, caffeine is a good one too. It's just, I don't know, the idea that that's a different type of addiction is just wild to me. And in America, it seems that vaping is more of an issue than in other countries. I mean, the UK has embraced it as a way to get smokers to stop. But what health authorities freaked out here. And I mean, that definitely has to do with the people who are dictating drug policies, as you said. But what is the difference between like why we approached it in the way we did and why the UK embraced it?
Yeah, there's different theories about that. A lot of people have talked, why did England embrace vaping, whereas America is treating it like, alcohol in the 19th century. Let's prohibit it. And one of the arguments that's been made is that in England they have a national healthcare system, so their healthcare policies materially affect the economic well-being of the country. And I mean, to an extent, that's true here in the U.S. as well. But politicians in the U.S., if they make a decision, for example, banning vaping and having people continue to smoke or switch back to smoking, the economic effects, they're not as culpable for that in our politics. It's not as easy to connect it because our healthcare system is still largely privatized. That's one of the theories. I personally think it has to be influenced, at least in part, by America's history with substances. Our sort of colonial past of We don't like anything that's just purely fun. We see it as immoral. Anything that's hedonistic, enjoyable physically. We value restraint in some ways. Morality, all of that. I think that really is the primary driver, and the influence of morality. I think it really becomes clear when you're talking about and the influence of the white middle class, priorities. Smoking in the U.S. is really low at this point, and it's been declining. It has been declining pretty steadily since the '90s, and really started to drop off since around the time of the introduction of vaping in the country. But there are populations within America where smoking rates are still extraordinarily high. If you look at indigenous populations, people with mental health disorders, the LGBTQ community, smoking rates are in the 30s, 40% of the population sometimes. People with schizophrenia, it's been reported, I think something like 70 to 80% continue to smoke. But, vaping is only really popular among affluent whites or middle class whites, pretty much. So that's why, and I think the clear the fact that white middle class values dictate not just U.S. policy but global public health policy in a lot of ways can be seen really clearly by the fact that in countries like the U.S., in countries like Australia and New Zealand, global public health entities are pursuing stricter regulation of nicotine products like vaping. But when they go into countries that are low and middle income, like India or the Philippines, they are recommending outright bans, outright prohibition. They put out papers saying you can't regulate these effectively, so you should just prohibit it. And in those countries, smoking is way higher than it is in the 80% of the world's population of smokers live in low and middle income countries. So it's absolutely startling that they are choosing to prioritize vaping in these countries. And even in the US, to a huge extent, they are functionally ignoring the issue of smoking, which kills people, whereas vaping does not. It's really astounding.
Yeah, I mean, we have something like 38 million cigarette users in our country, and it kills about like 480,000 people a year, which is a lot. And so when you look at nicotine and vaping n- specifically, that it's, I don't know, it's more of a public health thing. It's a better alternative than a, oh, it's just another way to like smoke. Well, yeah, it is. It's safer, but like it seems like banning it is ignoring the fact that you're actually trying to help people and that this is it's healthier, it's safer. I don't it just it frustrates me.
Yeah, I mean it's ironic that the pharmaceutical industry tried to make vaping in the 90s. They have inhalers and they just weren't accepted. Smokers just did not find them effective. And I think it is frustrating to people, to anti-tobacco people. It's not everybody in public health, but people who are really within the tobacco control movement. I think it's frustrating that the market itself, that a smoker in China and then the rest of the world smokers came up with vaping and embraced it and you know uh, had it evolve and played around with it and then found something that became extraordinarily effective. I talked to so many vapors and I've read some studies about it as well. So many who didn't even intend to quit smoking. They just started trying vaping because they were curious or they wanted a way to get their nicotine fix in spaces where smoking wasn't allowed or in their house, for example, without making their house smell like cigarette smoke, and they accidentally ended up switching because they ended up preferring it to smoking. That's absolutely mind-boggling, and when confronted with those facts, it's even more mind-boggling that people in public health who profess to care about saving lives and helping people live healthier lives, that they can ignore that for the sake of keeping kids away from something they're going to do anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's just crazy because I don't know, it seems like you're pushing first not only a group of people who are already very likely to suffer the consequences of using cigarettes and like smoking, you're pushing them further into that. And also kids, okay, well if kids are going to be like doing drugs, doing whatever, wouldn't you rather it be a little bit safer? I think.
No, actually, one of the things that made me kind of not happy, I'm not happy to see young people. I frankly, it's not that I'm happy or unhappy to see young people taking risks with their health. That's just what they do. They're just going to do it. But the fact that vaping was adopted uh, with so much more gusto in the younger cohort of American society, it kind of made me appreciate that young people do care about their health. They want to rebel and they want to experiment, they want to take risks, but they're not stupid. They don't want to do it in a way that's going to kill them. So the fact that they chose vaping over combustible cigarettes is something that should be not exactly celebrated, right? You don't want to encourage it. I don't think you can stop it, but you don't necessarily want to encourage it. Furthermore, I think honestly, the focus, the absolute fixation on youth vaping is what has caused spikes in youth vaping in this country. If you look at the UK, they have all the flavors. They have significant amounts of nicotine in their vapes. They have never experienced the surge in experimentation with vaping among youth that we have in the US. And I think part of that is because all of their public health communications from the government on vaping have been about, hey, are you an adult who smokes? You should try this. Go to a clinic. This will help you quit. Whereas in America, it's a sensationalistic thing of this is, reefer madness all over again. And that compels teenagers. They're like, ooh, this is a new way for me to rebel. Ooh, olds are telling me not to do something. Now I'm interested.
Yeah, I mean, I see that a lot. And it kind of reminds me of the entire campaign about like at least like in like public schools, and I know at my school for like the longest time, I mean, not while I was there, but they talked about like whenever they were talking about like sex and stuff, it was like, okay, it's like abstinence only, that's all we're teaching. And of course it's less safe because then like kids have no idea what they're doing. They're going to do it anyways, whatever. It seems to be the same thing here, kind of, except now kids like understand, oh, well, this is safer. But it seems to be taking the approach instead of being like, okay, you shouldn't do this, there are risks regardless, but this is safer than this, like these are alternatives. Or if you already struggle with this problem, here are alternatives. It just seems to completely ignore educating kids about that sort of thing. And I don't know. I mean, I'm very glad to see like kids around me and people my age and even like older. Like, yeah, you're right. Like younger generations adopting vaping instead of using cigarettes because it is safer and like they educated themselves because our schools haven't necessarily, I mean, I don't want them to embrace it, but at least, I don't know.
I think, for education, the message should, and I don't know honestly what the messages are right now in schools
It's
about
bad.
cannabis, but I think the message should be somewhat similar. Whatever you're telling the youth about using cannabis should be very similar to nicotine vaping, right? You say like, well, we wouldn't encourage you to engage in this, but if you're going to, here's a safe way to do it. Like one of the jokes I made, but I still think would have worked for public health prior to the COVID outbreak was, I think if you want to stop youth from vaping, because so much of it, if you're looking at the numbers and they're saying almost 30% of youth are vaping, they're not. Those are once a month numbers. Did you use it at all in the last month? That is someone at a party taking a hit off of their friend's jewel, right? So if you want to reduce, if all you care about is reducing those numbers, start a campaign that says if you share vapes, you can spread herpes. And then show pictures of kids with, cold sores on their mouths. And that instantly will make the numbers probably drop in half because most of those kids aren't going to go and try and get an actual device themselves. But if they are then also afraid of sharing a device with their friends, which, herpes is not a desirable thing, you probably should be concerned about that. And now with COVID, I think people are not doing that at all. But, that would have dropped the experimentation numbers. Most of the youth who are regularly vaping, people who, to habituate to nicotine, you pretty much have to use it every day, every couple of days, something like that. Those numbers, that's in the 1% range or in maybe 5% range. But then if you say, okay, let's take out youth who are already smoking, then it's like less than 1% of youth are regularly using nicotine vapor products who never smoked. So those numbers are not something to be really scared about it. But if you want to control those numbers, I would just say give kids the real information and say it's not risk free. because it's not. Neither is caffeine, neither is cannabis, neither is alcohol. But you should know that if you're going to pursue, definitely do this before you smoke. Absolutely. And I would say the same thing with cannabis. It would be better to use an edible or to vape it legally, buy them from a licensed retailer. That is safer, or, using a bong or something like that, than smoking it, because it's like if you stood in front of a fire. If you look at people who live where they have to burn wood in their homes, they have high rates of lung cancer. They have a lot of other health issues because human beings cannot process that amount of particulate matter and tar and all of the stuff that comes from burning product.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing because the more I read about this sort of stuff, and as you were talking, I was like, wow, like I bet that like all these people I know just don't really know that, because I didn't know that people who lived and like made fires regularly had higher rates of I mean, I'm not surprised now that I know it, but it's not something that I would just think. I was always like, oh yeah, it's just smoking cuz smoking and drugs. No, not really. I mean, yes, maybe, but like, if you're using it in a different form, that's not necessarily what's going to cause you to have lung cancer. And also the whole thing about the herpes campaign, I see that once, I'm never thinking about trying it ever again. Like, that's number one way to dissuade kids. You heard it here.
Yeah.
um so okay, a lot of the arguments, I mean, we've been talking about this, but against vaping are for the children, and we hear that we face this epidemic in the youth vaping, and that the flavors are the things that are enticing kids, but they really don't help adults. But then you see in Britain, they're completely fine. They're dealing with this well. Um, how are these arguments misleading and kind of dangerous in a way?
Well, I mean, the most dangerous aspect is that it focuses exclusively on youth behaviors, besides the fact that it's totally unsupported scientifically. I mean, if you just look at youth smoking rates, we had the biggest spike pretty much ever in the last 50 years of youth smoking occurred in the 1990s, just after they banned flavors in cigarettes. So those youth who were suddenly smoking in really huge numbers in the 1990s, they all were smoking just normal tobacco cigarettes, maybe menthol. Flavors in vapes, one of the arguments I make is, politicians will always hold up a vape and they'll say, look, it's gummy bear flavored. This is clearly marketed at youth. I was like, no, youth who want gummy bears and only gummy bears will just go buy gummy bears. They're cheaper, honestly. There is something else. Or, another argument I would make is, if you did a survey of all the people who eat pizza in this country, I bet you'll find that most people eat pepperoni pizza. But it's not pepperonis that are hooking people on pizza. They have a preference for it. If they're going to eat pizza, why not get it with pepperonis, right? So when you're vaping, part of the pleasure is the way it tastes. But that's not what drives people. If I want strawberry flavored something to drink, I don't necessarily go to a strawberry margarita. I could have strawberry tea or something else, or strawberry juice, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
There is something else going on. And then once someone has made the decision to use these products, of course they're going to use flavors. Frankly, from what I've heard from most users, tobacco flavored e-cigarettes taste like crap. They don't taste like cigarettes. They because it's synthetic, because you have to flavor the nicotine. There is no actual tobacco in a nicotine vapor product. You have to try and create some approximation of what tobacco tastes like, and it doesn't have the burning, which some smokers like. It's not right. But the other flavors, and one of the most important things for adult smokers. So first of all, most adult smokers use flavors, and most adult smokers who quit using e-cigarettes, who successfully transition completely, are using fruit candy flavored e-cigarettes. Part of the reason is because when you switch, when you stop smoking, your taste buds come back. Great, you can taste more flavors. And then you become used to the flavors in the e-cigarette. And then when you try going back to smoking, it tastes like crap. And people don't like that. So it reinforces their switching, because they're like, well, I didn't remember it tasting that bad. my vaporizer now tastes much better to me, so I'm not even going to bother going back to smoking. It's a really important factor in why vapors quit, and you really can't undervalue how important the pleasure aspect. So people who try and quit smoking with the patch, the gum, with the lozenge, those have really low quit rates. It's not nothing. People do quit using those products. It takes a lot of willpower to do that, but it's medicinal. It feels like you're making amends. You're going through treatment. When adults switch to vaping, when they try vaping, it is something fun. It is something pleasurable. It doesn't feel like punishment. And that makes it easier for people to stick with it. They feel good about themselves, which, self-efficacy, these feelings of empowerment, those are really important to helping people change their behaviors, whatever the behavior is.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing about gummy bears they are cheaper, dude. I don't know. I get frustrated to hear people make those arguments because I know I'm like, okay, but there's also you like a completely different feeling that you get from using drugs than eating candy. So if the drugs are candy flavored, you're not just going to do them because they're candy flavored.
And I
Like
almost hesitate to say this, but when those, it's almost always politicians who are holding up the unicorn poop vapes or gummy bear vapes, and or chocolate vapes, and I say, why aren't you talking about cannabis right now? What is the difference when you can literally get gummy worms, edible gummy worms? But we're not. And if they ever get that question, the response is usually, well, we're not talking about that right now. And I hesitate to say it because I do fear that very soon the same groups who are saying, we need to ban flavored vapes are going to turn their attention to cannabis products with the same arguments.
yeah, and I mean edibles are safer because as you said the smoking component and the burning component that's not present. So, ugh,
You're more likely to
frustration.
have a bad experience because people have a hard time dosing with edibles, from what I've heard and experienced myself, unfortunately. But you're not going to die from it, and it is way safer than someone who's habitually smoking cannabis.
Do you think, considering the failure of the government to win the war on drugs, and despite spending hundreds of billions of dollars in this effort, do you think that the government can deliver a risk free, nicotine free world? Because it seems like the goal is no nicotine at all instead of safe nicotine consumption.
Yeah, I think the goal for at least the tobacco control movement is as a nicotine free world. They've even started to say that, a nicotine free world instead of just a smoke free world. But I don't think the goal of the drug war is actually to win it. I think there are other goals that are achieved simply by having an ongoing war on drugs. And those include power. People get a lot of power when you can pass laws criminalizing certain behaviors in certain individuals, and money. A lot of, and this is why the word epidemic has become epidemic in the public health discourse, is because when you say that word, people holding the purse strings in Congress freak out, their constituents freak out, and put pressure on the politicians. And then the politicians, they just say, well, we're going to take these millions or these billions and give it to these groups to do something about this epidemic. Even if it never actually works, everyone kind of, wipes off their hands and says, well, we did something. Now everyone can stop worrying about it.
And that just makes me laugh now because the big scary word is pandemic. And so epidemic is like the little baby, tiny, non problematic cousin of pandemic. I don't know. I was thinking about that. It made me laugh. Okay. So, kind of on the same trail of talking about the people in power who are kind of doing things about this and the politicians who are like, oh, don't use this. This is bad. There's kind of a double standard between cannabis and vaping. So, back in September, you wrote a piece about this, and you noted that the biggest advocates for legalization of cannabis in the United States are also the worst drug warriors when it comes to vaping and kind of policies about that. Can you explain what is happening and what the inconsistency is about? Because to me, that's just it just doesn't make that much sense. That
Yeah, so Republicans, conservatives, people on the right side of the political divide in America, they have generally typically not cared too much about big tobacco, about smoking generally. They just they like big business. They sometimes pay lip service to individual choices and rights, but for the most part, they just don't care. And the same is true with vaping. For the most part, they just don't care. Liberals, Democrats, people on the left side of the political spectrum have since the 19th century been the ones leading any drug war. They are progressives, they are reformers, and they are the ones who have been leading the anti-vape charge while at the same time leading the cannabis reform charge, which is kind of a mind trip. Honestly, I think the best example of this happened in San Francisco last year, maybe 2 years ago, where the city board, the board of supervisors, tried to enact an ordinance that banned smoking and vaping in apartment buildings, in your own apartment. And it died because too many of the members said, well, we have to exempt cannabis smoking, even in that should be allowed, of course, even though we're going to ban vapor if it has nicotine in it. And that got attached to the bill, and then it failed for hypocrisy because people said this makes no sense. Where is the evidence that cannabis smoking is somehow less harmful to bystanders than nicotine vaping? And there is none, absolutely none. I mean, if anything, there's obvious evidence that if there are any harms associated with your neighbor smoking something, those are going to be way worse than if your neighbor is vaping something. Some Democrats, some liberals they do recognize the inconsistency in the position, the lack of integrity, let's say. But very few of them are saying anything about it publicly anyway. And they continue to fight this two-pronged war. And I think, honestly, part of the reason that they care at all about marijuana reform is, again, when we were talking about white suburban mothers. Cannabis use now is seen as a white behavior, whereas before it was pegged as being, a foreign menace from Mexican immigrants. But now, since the 70s, pretty much, it was white kids who were getting arrested for possession once cannabis, was criminalized and possession was criminalized. And so white parents, the threat was no longer the drug. The threat was drug enforcement. So it switched. So now the imperative, the priority is to save the white suburban kids from law enforcement and from having criminal records. So the narrative has shifted and the priorities have shifted. And now we're all interested in cannabis legals. I mean, they pay tons and tons of lip service. And some of them, I'm sure, genuinely understand the harms done by the drug war, by cannabis prohibition to minority communities and marginalized communities. But that's not the reason that the narrative actually shifted and the politics started to move in the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, so I read a piece by Kevin Williamson a while ago, and he kind of makes a similar point. He wrote that that this is, quote, not a regulatory issue or a law enforcement issue or a public health issue, it's a class issue. And he says, think of it this way: smoking is a problem for people who shop at Walmart, but our public policies are made by the people who shop at Whole Foods, end quote. First, I laughed at that because it's just a very clever way to make that point. But I don't know, it seems in line with what you're saying.
Oh, no, that's I love that quote. It's absolutely spot on. And that, like I said, the most politically empowered class in this country. And part of that is from, our past, our history. There is a huge dichotomy between the dominant group, which is white suburban middle class people, and everybody else. So it really is white suburban people who dictate government policies and approaches and perception about substance use, right? So when a drug or a substance is associated with white culture, it's acceptable, even if there are problems with it, like alcohol. When it is associated with an other, as cannabis was in the early 20th century, opium smoking was with Chinese people in the 19th century, even acid, which is associated with urban youth, urban culture, rebellion against, the 1950s, 1960s wholesome middle-class family. Those are deemed illicit, problematic, and need criminal penalties. They need to be controlled. But if those drugs ever do become reassociated with white culture, with white middle-class culture, then they need to be decriminalized. We need to do treatment over criminalization. We saw that with the opioid, quote, epidemic. If you look at the way the news talks about the prescription opioid epidemic, and P.S., this is fundamentally the same as heroin use. opioid addicts are always portrayed as either poor Southern people, poor Southern whites, or middle class whites. There are tons and tons of stories about the new face of addiction, heroin in the suburbs, which is opioids. And the approach to the opioid addiction epidemic has generally been treatment. We have drug courts. We don't want to put these people in jail for using prescription opioids. It's the bad doctors who prescribed it to them. We want to help them. We have methadone. We want to make sure they don't die. We can revive them. All of this. Whereas the portrait of heroin use, if you look at the anti-drug commercials that were on television, and I mean, not to mention crack cocaine versus cocaine, these are the same things. Non-white substance use behaviors, they always get the criminal treatment. They have commercials from those eras. They'll have the evil criminal pusher trying to get your kids hooked on drugs, and the cops need to come in and deal with them. And it's always urban, broken families, all of this stuff, minority communities. Whereas white substance use behaviors are maybe problematic, and maybe we need to take a nice soft touch with it.
And in the same piece that Williamson wrote, this kind of really, I don't know, it kind of shocked me in a way, especially because of the way that it's being dealt with. And this follows kind of what you're saying. Is he said that, quote, teenage marijuana use, for example, is about 35% more frequent than teenage vaping, end quote, which is what we don't hear. We don't see, we don't see that. And I don't know, I feel like it tells you a lot.
Yeah, I mean, no. So one of my big issues with drug use in public health, the drug control, even drug educational stuff, it is always takes the issues in isolation. We say, well, kids are smoking or vaping, whatever it is, using cannabis, and we don't like that. We need to address that. They rarely address why someone chooses to engage in those behaviors. What is it about their life, their brain chemistry, their situation? What is it that is compelling them to experiment with or become habituated to, addicted to, whatever it is, these drugs? Oftentimes, a friend of mine, Sally Sattel, tells this story pretty frequently. When soldiers were in Vietnam, American soldiers, the rates of heroin use were extraordinarily high, and Richard Nixon was becoming very concerned with the end of the war that we would have a flood of addicts coming into the country. So they started to try and incentivize people to quit. They said, well, you have to give us a urine sample, and it has to be clean before you can come home. And most people were able to, most of the soldiers were able to do that, come home. Almost none of them relapsed. Why? What's the difference? Why, when they come home, heroin, which is considered commonly one of the most addictive substances, why, once they were home, did almost none of them use again? And it's because their life situation changed. They had family, friends, social support, things to do. They weren't surrounded by, boredom punctuated by terror, which they were experiencing in Vietnam. So I think we really need to look at the whole situation. And, like I said, we're worried about youth and drugs, which I think is a valid concern for public health to say, well, how do we, like I said, like with, sex, young people and sex, how do we encourage young people to engage in the best behavior, to do things in the safest way possible, make the best choices for themselves? One of the biggest risks to people your age, actually, is suicide. I think it's the second or third leading cause of death among people under the age of 35. And that is not something we're talking about at all. That public health isn't talking about at all. And I think because, unlike substance use issues, you instantly recognize the complexity involved in suicide, and that it has so much to do with a person's mental health, with their economics, with their social life, all of that. So I think one of the reasons it's not being addressed is because there aren't seemingly easy solutions in policy for it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's easier to be like, "Oh, we got rid of the gummy bear vapes. Look, we did something." But there's nothing you can do that's tangible like that with an issue like suicide, or at least that they've thought of yet, which I don't know, we'll see. Um so now I want to talk about a policy study you wrote about salt, kitchen salt, sodium chloride. And you start in there by explaining that, quote, the notion that if you eat too much salt, you will have high blood pressure has been perceived as medical gospel that most people, including this author, believed for the past 3 decades, end quote. Your paper, however, concludes that 40 years of government policies meant to reduce sodium consumption for the sake of reducing hypertension have failed. So, first, can you kind of tell us why hypertension is such a big priority for the government?
Well, I mean, like smoking, hypertension, with that come a lot of problems. You have cardiovascular disease. It stresses out, your vasculature system and can lead to death. A lot of people die from hypertension, as it seems, from hypertension related disorders. Hypertension, and with most medical issues, there are so many other factors involved. Someone who has hypertension likely also has cardiovascular disease, is likely also obese, is probably smoking, is also probably old. So you're like, which one of they also don't exercise. Which one of these things is resulting in death? But hypertension is very serious. There is nothing more fundamental to the survival of a human body, honestly, than fluid dynamics, than making sure that your body has the right composition of water and solutes like salt, metals, things like this. This helps your blood and your cells transfer nutrients between and get rid of toxins. Without the appropriate balance, you can't get rid of toxins in your body. Your kidneys fail. You get a buildup of toxins, you die. This is one of the reasons that you can live for 30 days without eating food, up to that amount anyway. Most people can live at least a week or two. You're going to die in a couple of days without water because your body will not be able to pump its own blood enough to get it to your organs. It won't be able to clean your blood and get it where it needs to go, and you will experience organ failure pretty quickly. And salt is fundamental to that process. Salt is what helps your body move water and nutrients around. And I think some people have talked about a salt hunger as being the third kind of instinct, where you have food hunger. Salt seems to be an instinctual thing for most people, where if they've done experiments where half the group will get a placebo tablet and the other half will get a sodium tablet. And then they will have them eat, and you can add salt if you want to. And the group that was getting the sodium tablet would not use the salt shaker, pretty much. And then the group that wasn't getting sodium, they were getting the placebo, they would add salt to their food so that both sides of the group were functionally eating the same amount of sodium. If you look around the world, I've heard researchers describe it as eerie how similar, except for in countries that are disrupted by wars, where there's extreme and widespread poverty. Almost every country eats around the same amount of sodium in their diet every day. And it's about, I think, 4,000 milligrams per day, which is about 1,000 to 2,000 more than the government recommends. And I always say, who are these people who looked at the entire world and said, you are all wrong? We are right. Like, all of humanity is wrong, but we are right. You need to eat this amount of salt. And in my research, as you mentioned, I believed all of this stuff before I went into the research with a really simple question. I thought initially I was only thinking I would do a blog post before I functionally wrote a small book, which the question was, where and why did we come up with the sodium guidelines that we currently have?
I think about that a lot when I think
How
about
did where does this number come from? And I started digging through congressional testimony and the research, and I found that it was basically out of nowhere. It was out of thin air. Uh,
Yeah, I see that happening a good amount. What has the government done in addition to kind of setting this guideline to try to address this problem and kind of deal with all the salt stuff?
well, no shock. It started with the children. So at first, the government started to strong arm the makers of baby food to reduce sodium in the baby food. And that worked. And then they started putting pressure on them to do voluntary sodium reductions in adult foods. And we see that around the world, in the Western world, in the United Kingdom and America and Canada and Australia, where there's a big push to reduce the sodium amounts in foods, because the theory is that people will just eat salt. They will just eat salt, and if you put it in the food, they don't know how much is in there, and they'll just eat and eat it, eat as much as they possibly can without knowing that they're getting too much. P.S. That's not. If you have healthy kidneys functioning properly, that is not what happens. Is that, first of all, your body can process an extraordinary amount of sodium. We're talking in the 50,000 milligrams a day range without any problems. It cycles it around. It retains it, instead of just flushing it all out. Sometimes like, we still need this, circle it back around. So every day your kidneys are doing that amount. Getting 4,000 milligrams a day extra in your diet if you have healthy kidneys, really shouldn't be an issue. And most people will instinctually choose foods that are higher or lower depending on what their body needs.
That's that's amazing. I don't know I don't know, that just amazes me so much, but also the fact that the government at this point, it makes me think the government's like, "Oh, not only do you not know what's good for you, but your body doesn't know what's good for you, but we do. We and our arbitrary numbers, we know."
I will say there is so, and in my research, one of the things I found that was really, really fascinating was there is a certain group of people, maybe about 25%, who become salt sensitive, and in their case, if their body is not telling them they've had enough sodium, if they're eating too much, they're they can have sodium related, diet related hypertension. But there's also an almost same amount in the population that are inversely salt sensitive, meaning that if they don't get enough salt, they will become hypertensive because it's their
Wow.
body trying to balance out. They're trying to like pump up your vessels will constrict in order to move the blood around without the salt, because the salt helps you retain water, and that helps, basically helps you retain water so that your blood can move it, I'm sorry, your vessels can move it around your body and get everything going where it needs to go. If you don't have enough water, your vessels constrict so that it can, it's kind of like putting your finger over the nozzle of a hose to get it to move faster. That's what your body's doing when it's restricting. So that's what hypertension functionally is that your vessels are constricting chronically, and that causes a lot of stress on them.
That's the human body fascinates me. It's just amazing. I don't know. Yeah. So what have the effects been of this government war against sodium?
I mean, honestly, I think people have, it's I think people feel frustrated a lot of times. People feel like they don't know what's good for them, frankly, and I think that's very problematic. They feel ineffectual, especially people who are at risk for hypertension or who already have hypertension. They're told reduce your amount of salt to this extremely low level, and if you've never tried it, you should. It's really, really hard. Everything tastes horrible. I've tried to do it myself. I don't eat an extraordinary amount of sodium. I'm pretty close to the guidelines actually most days, but when I tried to reduce it to the actual guidelines level, it became very difficult to eat my normal healthy diet because it was just filled with too much sodium, even egg whites. Pretty much my breakfast, I just burst through the guidelines limit. Uh, and then so you have someone with hypertension who says, okay, my doctor tells me to reduce my sodium. And then they can't do it because for one thing, they feel bad. For another thing, they don't enjoy food, which is important for, just life. And they give up. Then they give up and they're like, well, if that didn't do it, nothing will. When the government isn't telling people that, they're not emphasizing other strategies that are way more effective for a bigger number of people. If reducing the risks of hypertension are the goal, eat more fiber, eat more potassium, get some exercise, lose weight. All of these are more effective than trying to force people, which is almost impossible, to force people to reduce sodium below their body's natural craving for it or what it needs. It's really hard. It's like telling someone to not eat when they're hungry.
Yeah, and that doesn't really work. That's I don't know. It's frustrating and I mean, I don't know. Well, the knowledge on this sort of stuff is changing slowly but surely. Thank you so much for this. I've learned a ton. So to wrap up, what is one thing you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on and why?
I mean, that's a tough question. I changed my opinion on small things loads of times. I think honestly, the biggest change in my life that has occurred, and through the work that I've been doing, that we've been talking about, is when I was younger, high school, college. I thought there was a capital T truth and solutions, that things could be fixed, that if people just had the knowledge or the government had the right tools, that we could fix people's problems. And I've really come to the position that is neither true nor advisable, in that you
Mhm.
cannot there's no amount of cajoling, stigmatizing, banning, forcing, whatever, that will make people do what you think is best for them, and that I don't think it's appropriate either. I really think people are happiest, they're living their best lives when they are making informed choices that are best for them. And that may not look right to the rest of us. What they're doing may not look good. We may not think that it doesn't work for our lives, but for them, their goals, what they enjoy, how they want to live their lives, how long they want to live. Not everybody wants to live forever. Some people would rather, enjoy 70 good years than 80 kind of rough years. So I think what I've learned is that it is always inadvisable to try and force people to change, and especially inadvisable when the government tries to do it.
Yeah, that's I see that. I think I see that a lot around me, but like only with specific things. Like kids will be posting on their social media, don't assume like you know what's best for this type of person, and then they go and in the other direction are telling people what is good for them and what they have to do. And they're like, if the government doesn't do this, then we all are gonna like fall off the face of the earth because we don't know how to take care of ourselves. But like they say it in a nicer way.
That's the
And
other thing I've learned is that adults know almost nothing. Even scientists know almost nothing. They talk like they do, and they certainly know a lot. They can be experts in their area, but even experts, even people who know more than any other human being on earth, what they do know is so small that it doesn't that and they speak with such authority and such righteousness that is, in my opinion, unwarranted. That I think I'm not necessarily a fan of misplaced humbleness, but I really think having some recognition about the limits of knowledge, the knowledge that we do have, is really important in any, not just government, not just policy, not for experts, even just your normal everyday life, of recognizing that I don't know everything, and that's okay. Here's what I think I know, and then go from there when you talk to people or when you engage with research or trying to understand something.
yeah, that's true. I do think about that a lot. I'm like, okay, they know, but what if the research changes and indicates something else later? Well, then they don't know. And the thing is also, how does that fit into the greater world?
Mhm.
Well, I don't know. You don't know that. I don't know that. So how I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you again. This is all the time we have for today. Michelle, thank you again for your time and for your insight. I would also like to thank everyone who listens, subscribes, and shares the Great Antidote podcast. If you would like to be on the podcast or if you have a guest in mind, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@thecgo.org. Thank you. Bye.